Hey kiddos, so today we are going to talk about Reconstruction. We have now ended the Civil War, 4 years of bloodshed and economic depression. Over 700,000 Americans' lives have been lost. And now there's this great problem of how to put this country back together. So the United States was divided before the Civil War, which is obviously is what culminated in the violence that took place. And so imagine now, after the war, you have the winning side and the losing side. Again, how do you put it back together? And much like the American Revolution, where it was kind of that same issue that fighting the war is one thing, but what do you do once you win? In the American Revolution, obviously, it was like, how do we create a government that can last, right? They were trying to fix a government that they felt was broken or get away from a government that was broken. And after the Civil War, you have half of the country that felt as though their government didn't represent them. And so how do you make sure that you kind of heal the wounds? And what we're getting ready to kind of look into is what is the right amount of punishment? What's the right thing to do with African Americans? And it's a period of time in American history that's had great repercussions when we think long term, and we're going to talk a little bit about those today. So first, here are the most difficult questions that need to be answered after the war. And this is what political leaders like Abraham Lincoln was thinking as early as 1863. How would the South rebuild its society and its economy? And that's going to be a major issue. We'll talk more about that after we get back from or during winter break. You'll be reading about it, and we will kind of talk about it a little bit. But that's for sure a problem. The Southern economy is it's devastated, completely devastated. Over 9,000% inflation. A lot of the paper money that they printed is now worthless. It was never really backed with gold. Farms are destroyed. Their labor, in some cases, 25% of white Southerners have now lost the labor that they kind of depended on, which also keep in mind that was a lot of their investments. It's not like they had money in the bank necessarily. Their capital was invested in humans and land. And when the demand goes down for the land, and when those human beings are finally given their freedom, it creates a chain reaction of economic turmoil. How would those 4 million freedmen fit in to that Southern society? What are we going to do as a nation, as a federal government, to protect them and to try and improve relations? And it'll kind of even be ignored at times, but that's something that also needs to be addressed. To what extent, if any, is the federal government responsible for helping those freedmen? Is this just, we've got the 13th Amendment passed and ratified by December of 1865, but is that their job? Is this a state's issue? And so they're going to look into that. Should former Confederate states be treated as states or as conquered territory? If it were Lincoln that was getting to implement his plan, he would have said they're states, right? He never recognized the Confederacy as a legitimate government. Through the duration of the war, he constantly referred to, Southerners as Americans, and he tried to also, you'll even notice with his Reconstruction plan, kind of keep that in mind. And that was the level of leadership and maturity that Abraham Lincoln possessed. Others wanted to punish the South, and we'll talk about that as well. What should be the conditions that these Confederate states are accepted as equals, especially like as they restore the Union, like in Congress, like when do they get their representation back? And the most important question, and why I think Reconstruction probably was not as successful, is who has the authority to decide these questions? Is it the president or is it Congress? Okay. Now, if we go back in time a little bit, I know that we talked about the assassination of Lincoln in our last lecture. But again, when you're talking about major planning in anything, whether it be in government, in business, in any case, you have to kind of think long term. So Abraham Lincoln, once the war started, he was already thinking, all right, so let's say we win. What are we going to do? What are we going to do after we win? And again, he did not believe that the states should be treated as kind of like a conquered territory, or that he never considered the Confederacy a legitimate government. So he had a very simple, lenient plan for those states that were in rebellion. He really saw it more on as the people to blame were the political leaders of those states, not so much the people themselves. Now, obviously, those people are going to support those governments, right? But he was not trying to, throw former Confederate soldiers in jail or even Confederate leaders. So his plan, mostly you can refer to it as the 10% plan. Its formal name was the Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction, but most people just kind of refer to it as the 10% plan, and you can do that. Is that he was going to give pardons, okay, to most Confederates who followed or who met these requirements. You have to take an oath of allegiance to the U.S., to the United States government, and to the Constitution. And you also need to accept the emancipation of slaves. So if you were a slave owner, that was something that you had to accept and do. Now, notice though that this was after the Emancipation Proclamation, so there was no 13th Amendment quite yet. So that probably changed in his mind in the spring of 1865 before he was assassinated. But this was his official plan that he had kind of come up with a couple years before in the aftermath of the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, once 10% of a state's population has taken that oath, right, pledged loyalty, once that gets to 10% of the state pre-war voters that had accomplished that, then the state government would be allowed to rewrite a constitution that abolished slavery and be readmitted to the Union. He wanted it to be as quick as possible, as lenient as possible. He did not see the value in punishing Southerners for this act. He felt like everyone had been punished enough after 750,000 dead. And so he just wanted to kind of move on. Now, Republicans are going to object to this, right? He said it was way too lenient. They had kind of more the position that that the South needed to be held accountable for these actions, and that they should be punished. So they're going to put forward the Wade Davis bill, which instead of 10% of pre-war voters, it was going to be 50% to take that pledge of loyalty. And only non-Confederates could vote for the new state constitution. So if you actually took up arms, if you enlisted in the Confederate Army, you're going to lose that voting power. Lincoln thinks that it's too strict, that it's ridiculous, and so he is going to does not sign it. It's a pocket veto, so he's going to leave it on his desk and let it go. One thing that they did agree on is going to be the Freedmen's Bureau, and to me, this is probably one of the most obvious pieces of success from Reconstruction. There are some big things, but then in the details is where there are going to be a lot of failures. But the Freedmen's Bureau was one that did a lot of good. And so this was an early welfare agency. It was for not only freedmen, African Americans, but also for poor Southern whites that had been displaced. So if you think of Sherman's March, that's kind of the easiest one to think about, is if you were displaced after Sherman's March, if he burned your farm down, right, you could then go get aid from the Freedmen's Bureau if you had nowhere else to go or to turn. Their greatest success was that of education. So they established about 3,000 schools for freed Blacks, and some of them even colleges. Federal funding is going to stop in 1870, but most of the schools are going to continue in some regard. They won't be called a freedmen's school anymore. But those schools will continue to exist. But by 1870, about 200,000 African Americans were taught to read and write in those schools. And I know I have a photograph here of children, but there were adults that were sitting in these schools and learning for the first time. And that is one of the successes when you think about that with freedom, with the 13th Amendment. They had the ability to do simple things like that, things that today I feel like a lot of people take for granted. So when Lincoln's assassinated in April of 1865, it's going to kind of bring an end to those more lenient plans. Andrew Johnson is super complex. He is a Democrat from Tennessee. He was a U.S. Senator. He grew up very poor in Tennessee and always hated the institution of slavery, but not for like moral reasons, but instead because as a poor white in Tennessee, he and neighbors like him were unable to compete economically. Now, he was one of the people that kind of like worked really hard and took advantage of opportunities and was able to kind of move himself up, becoming a U.S. Senator. But he knows that those opportunities weren't available to all poor whites. And so he really advocated for a lot of poor whites who struggled to compete with those planters. And you're going to see that how he treats ex-Confederates kind of reflects that a little bit. So Johnson's Reconstruction plan, when he becomes president, and remember why he was vice president. If you're a little bit confused how Abraham Lincoln, who was a Republican, and Andrew Johnson, a Tennessee Democrat, remember in 1864, they were trying to unite all Northerners under Lincoln. So there were a lot of Democrats in the North that were kind of questioning whether or not they should support Lincoln or the war, right? Because there were Democrats that were Unionists, but they really didn't like Lincoln. And so they really had to get them on board. And Johnson provided that as a running mate. He was a Unionist at heart, and he was, even though he was a white supremacist, he did believe in preserving the Union. And so they ran under that Unionist party in 1864. So that's how he was able to, why you had a Republican and a Democrat. I'm pretty sure that's the only time in history that that's happened where you had, I'll have to double check that, but I'm pretty sure that's the only time that that's ever happened. Okay. So he becomes president and his policy is extremely lenient like Lincoln, but again, not for really the same reasons. Like Johnson didn't think that, or he didn't want to punish like the poor whites that like were conscripted. Remember that there was conscription on both sides. And he wanted to use the Civil War to create an economy and a society that allowed for those poor whites to kind of be lifted up in an economy where they no longer have to compete with the institution of slavery. So this is the kicker that got me. Like, it really shows you kind of a little bit about Johnson's character. Is so where Lincoln was going to give anyone and everyone a pardon just based on whether or not they took the loyalty oath, Johnson reserved it for anyone that so if you basically own more than $20,000 in property, okay, he prevented you from being able to vote, okay, unless you personally requested, like you had to personally request a pardon from him. They had to write a letter or whatever, and then he would decide whether or not you would be pardoned. And that was just like this power trip that he was on. He was trying to it was his little dig at all of those wealthy planters where he felt like now he's in control. And that's how he decided to do it. So even though those were the rules, he ended up issuing the pardons because they needed the economy to kind of get going. They needed new elected officials and he wanted them to have representation. It's not like not every poor man was willing to like run for Congress or Senate. So he ended up issuing these pardons to those disloyal, those wealthy Confederates pretty quickly. And most of them are back in office by the end of 1865. And that has a lot to do with the fact that Congress had adjourned. So if you're not aware of this, like Congress, they're not in DC all the time. They're not always in session. Part of it is for them to go back to their home states and be with the constituents and work from home, and then only go to DC when like laws needed to be passed. It's not really how it works anymore. A lot of people stay in DC almost year round. I will say today they're in session more often, but they're out of session. So like during the summer months, they're out of session. At this point in time in history, remember that they have to have time to travel. Like today you can get on an airplane and you're, in Hawaii in a matter of, 13 hours or something. That's our furthest state. Back then, they would have to get all the way to California and back if they decided to do that. But anyway, so they're out of session. And so he was able to quickly kind of get them in, even though no one had yet decided who was in charge of the Reconstruction process. So within 8 months after he takes office, all 11 ex-Confederates under his plan qualified to be readmitted to the Union. The southern states drew up new constitutions. It talked about that, you can't secede. It negated the war debts. It ratified the 13th Amendment. That was one thing that he had required. And Republicans are extremely angered when they hear of all of these things. So, for example, when they hold elections that year, Alexander Stephens, who was the vice president of the Confederate States, he was elected in Georgia back into the United States Senate. And the Republicans are like, this can't happen. Like he was literally less than, 10 months ago, less than a year ago, he had actively taken up arms against the Constitution and against the United States Senate. They're also angered that a lot of southern states are passing new laws called Black Codes. It's a series of laws, southern legislatures. So yes, African Americans are now free, but we're not going to let it happen that easily. And so they passed a series of laws, and they range from state to state. That's the most important thing, because a lot of kids get the Black Codes kind of confused. Each state had different laws, okay? It prohibited them from renting land or borrowing money to own land. They couldn't purchase a weapon. They had to be employed. It's called a vagrancy law. You had to be employed by a white man. You had to prove it. And if you didn't have proof that you were employed by a white man, you would be thrown into jail. So this is the beginning of mass incarceration among African-American men, where they are chain gangs. So where they are, because remember the 13th Amendment said that servitude was illegal unless for committing a crime. And so a lot of African-American men, all of a sudden, right, in the books on paper, it looks as though there are these laws that are being broken, even though sometimes it was just made up. That just the sheriff would come by and say, "Oh, you're under arrest," and they would charge them with something, even though they hadn't done it. It's not like there was juries with, or trials or lawyers or anything like that. And so a lot of corruption took place. And so that was also taking African-American men kind of like outside of the home. And it's going to have ripple effects long term. African-Americans couldn't testify against whites in court, just little things like that were, again, keeping them as low men on the totem pole, legally within society, very discriminatory policies. Now, Johnson supported all of these. He said states' rights. Yeah, that's fine. He was for sure a white supremacist. And he also wanted to keep African-Americans lower than the poor working class whites as well, because that was something that a lot of Southern whites and Northern whites were fearful of, is that with abolition, what is going to happen to our jobs and our like competition wise, and what's going to happen to neighborhoods and land sales and like all of those things. The uncertainty and the biases that existed. People do silly things when they're afraid, and that was very obvious. That happened in the South and in the North. So by spring of 1866, Johnson, the Southern legislatures had kind of actually united a lot of the Republicans that they needed to do something about Reconstruction. Okay. At this time, the Republican Party is split. And if you chose to watch the film Lincoln, you see how the Republican Party is split between the moderates and the radicals. And there's actually another faction of the conservative Republicans, but we don't need to get into that. So where moderate Republicans are kind of that view of like the former Whig Party, where it was very like fiscally focused, tariffs, industry, like expansion west and the railroads and that kind of view. Radical Republicans were more focused on Reconstruction and the well-being of the freedmen in the South and protecting them, one, and also providing opportunities for them. So civil rights for Blacks did not have a lot of support, but more people are going to join after 1866 because they're fearful that the Democratic Party is going to become more dominant. So the 3/5 clause of the Constitution, or the Compromise, now that that slavery is abolished, that undid, which means representation-wise, those Southern states are now going to have more elected officials. Are they going to be Republicans or Democrats? The Civil Rights Act of 1866, basically they're moving into the idea that they want to get voting rights for African Americans so that they can vote with the Republican Party. Before you can even talk about voting rights, we have to define citizenship, and we also have to protect them of that. Remember that one of the things that when they were in bondage, when they were enslaved, they were protected because they were property, right? There was some value. So there wasn't, there was not a lot of like killing or murdering of them for whatever reasons, like unless there was something like major that happened. After they're emancipated, there is like no value on their lives. And so that's when the lynchings began, the KKKs, we're going to talk about them in a second. And so they're really worried about that. And there were a lot of murders and a lot of violence, and we'll talk about that in class. So they have the Civil Rights Act of 1866. This is the first major law, this is important, ever passed over a presidential veto. Now there's going to be a lot more over the next few years with Johnson. And Republicans, again, they're scared that if Democrats ever got control in Congress, that they would repeal the law. So what's more difficult to overturn is a constitutional amendment. And again, they're trying to get this done before Southern states get that representation. So the 14th Amendment, to me, it's like probably one of the most important amendments that we have in the Constitution. It talks about citizenship and due process. This is going to be used in the 20th century for a lot of the civil rights legislation. Probably one of the most important things that was established in June of 1866 is going to be the report on the Joint Committee. So a joint committee between the House of Representatives and the United States Senate, they meet and they assess, basically they go into the South, they do some research, and they try to figure out like what is it that needs to be done. And they realize that they need to do more. And they also establish that it is Congress, not the president. It doesn't fall within the presidential powers, even though we've never had a civil war before, and so we don't really know how to even like put it back together. But they decide that it's the job of Congress, not the president, to rejoin the Union. And so all of like Johnson's plans are basically reversed. Okay, Johnson is obviously upset, but they don't seat any of those people that have been elected so far under Johnson's plan in those Southern states. And so they're gonna come up with their own plan of readmitting the states, and then also working on representation and elected officials and all of that. So in the 1866 midterm election, so the fall of 1866, Johnson decides to go, he's going to campaign. So this is a midterm election, so he's not up for election. And he calls it his swing around the circle campaign. He is criticizing the Republican Party. He argues that they are wanting to, especially with the 14th Amendment, Africanize society. There's a ton of propaganda that is published that it's just blatantly like racist. You can kind of see behind me. There are other examples that exist about the Republican Party with equality, and they're talking about voting rights. The Republicans are going to respond with their own propaganda, okay? And basically what it does is it says all Southerners are Democrats. So if you're a Democrat, like in the North, right? So remember we talked about before that Democrats existed in the North and the South. Now it's going to kind of become like taboo to vote with the Democratic Party, because that means that you would then condone the behavior of like the war and rebellion. So they really kind of like lump those guys together where they say like, well, if you vote for the Democratic Party, like you're voting with the party of the rebels. And it works. So Johnson and what he's doing, his actions are going to really bring those moderates and the radical Republicans kind of together. They're going to win in that 1866 election, and it's going to they're going to have a majority, a 2/3 majority in the House and in the Senate. And so it's going to make it a little bit easier to get those amendments passed, those constitutional amendments. The most important, I think, piece of legislation for sure is going to be this Reconstruction Act. Sometimes you'll see it as the Military Reconstruction Act of 1867. Radical Republicans and moderates are coming together on this bill. Johnson's going to veto it. It's going to be overturned. Congress is going to pass a series of other ones, and to kind of like refine it and make it a little bit better, Johnson's going to veto every single one of those, and they're all going to be overturned. So you can see that there's a lot of tension between Johnson and Congress. And that's very important in understanding, because we're eventually going to get to his impeachment. The acts divided up the 10 Confederate states at this point into 5 temporary military districts, and each of the districts is going to be run by a Union general in the United States Army. So they are going to occupy the southern states yet again. So this was something that Lincoln did not want. But again, remember, they can pass all the laws they want at the federal level, okay? But if Southerners are not willing to enforce those laws, so if they say you have to treat African Americans equally under the law, so which that would outlaw a lot of the black codes, right, because of the due process. But if Southern officials aren't enforcing it, right, then African Americans are still being threatened with violence and economic and political and social discrimination. And so Congress's only option is to put the military in these states, put them in these towns, and enforce the laws, okay? No voter intimidation. Protect people who are registering African Americans to vote. You could file a complaint if you go to a bank and you apply for a loan and it's turned down based on your race, things like that, okay? The military is there to enforce the Civil Rights Act, the 14th Amendment. Okay. And that's one of the purposes of the Reconstruction Act, or the Military Reconstruction Act. In addition to that, they're going to increase the requirements for gaining readmission to the Union. So ex-Confederate states, they have to ratify the 14th Amendment. Their state constitutions, they have to abolish, they have to provide voting rights for all men. So black men are going to get the right to vote. Eventually, we are going to have the 15th Amendment. But so if they can do it in those states quickly, because remember, it does take time to ratify an amendment. So if they can do it earlier, if they can put it in their state constitutions, they're hoping that more African American men will get opportunity to vote in that next cycle of elections. So once you do all of those things, voters could elect delegates to a state convention. So think of their legislature. They can write a new state constitution that guaranteed black suffrage. Eligible voters then would need to ratify the state constitution. So those are the ex-Confederates that have or non-Confederates that have that are eligible to vote. A lot of the wealthy ex-Confederates still don't have the right to vote. They were disenfranchised because of it. So we're talking about certain leaders. Elections could then be held for state offices. Congress would approve the Constitution. The state legislature would need to ratify the 14th Amendment. And then they could be readmitted to the Union, which means that they could have representation. They could elect a U.S. senators and U.S. House of Representatives. So with all that, and that kind of doesn't really seem all that bad to us, but it seemed really bad to Southerners in 1867. However, if you think about with hindsight, it could have been so much more strict on Southern whites. It could have been more radical. The military rule was established. It was only temporary. It was only for about 10 years. They didn't know that at the time, but they knew it was going to be temporary. Confederate leaders weren't prosecuted for treason. They weren't permanently banned from politics. I mean, Robert E. Lee like went and was president of a university and, you know, died years later, happy in his home and not in prison. They did not confiscate or redistribute property, and originally that was what they were doing. Before Johnson became president, so within that probably, I don't know, 6 to 8 months before it kind of got rolling, where Johnson's policies were being implemented and he started pardoning people. Originally, union leaders were dividing up former plantations to the freedmen, so they confiscated it like during the war, and they were redistributing it to the freedmen. And they believed, unfortunately, like it's so sad, but they believed that they were going to own land now, so it was like a form of reparation. Sherman, during Sherman's march, was going through and dividing up the land, 40 acres. We're going to give you 40 acres and a mule. And certain communities like even did, but then that land was taken back away from them once Johnson started to pardon some of those Confederates. And then Congress didn't ever go back and fix that part. They let that part stay. Thaddeus Stevens, again, okay, so Thaddeus Stevens was someone that was in favor of Sherman's 40 acres and a mule, because again, what they were trying to do is to create kind of a new class of self-sufficient Black farmers. If they're just working for whites, they're not going to have any type of upward mobility. We need to create a new social class of African-American landowners, do away with that planter aristocracy. And for the most part, the planter aristocracy, for the most part, was, I mean, a lot of people lost everything. I know, like, just from like personal genealogy, that like just from noticing like how much former like ancestors, like what type of land that they own, and then I think about like my like more immediate ancestors of who I'm descended from were very, very poor whites, and so I wonder like where in the timeline of everything did my ancestors kind of lose all of that economic stability. And probably more than likely it happened here at the Civil War, if I were to dive into it a little bit more. But there were still some really wealthy whites that owned a lot of land and had sharecroppers and tenant farmers, which we'll talk about in a second. So there is one problem with the Military Reconstruction Act, and that is the fact that the president is the commander-in-chief, and he's in charge of the military. Okay. Currently, at this point in time, Johnson, and you already know that Johnson and Congress don't get along. So Congress is trying to go around Johnson, but they're going to need Johnson to support the Military Reconstruction Act. But at this point, they're not basing it so much on Johnson, but they're hoping that the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, because Edwin Stanton is a Republican and a very good friend of Abraham Lincoln and agreed with the radical Republicans. He can't stand Johnson. He's trying to kind of fulfill more of the vision that Abraham Lincoln kind of had, where there are more opportunities for African Americans and that they should be protected and their civil rights should be protected. And so Stanton is, because he was Lincoln's Secretary of War, he is still currently Johnson's Secretary of War at this point in time. And so Congress passes a piece of legislation because they're worried that that Johnson is going to fire Stanton. Okay. And appoint someone, even though it probably wouldn't get selected, but appoint someone that wouldn't follow these orders with the military. So they pass a piece of legislation called the Tenure of Office Act, and it prevented the president from removing any federal officials or military commander without the approval of the Senate. So what they're doing is, in order for a cabinet member or an important position, like a judge or whatever, in order for them to be appointed by the president, the Senate has to approve. Now they're saying, in addition to that, if you want to fire that official, the Senate also has to approve of the removal. Problem is, Constitution doesn't really say that, right? Where it says that the approval is in the Constitution, it was probably unconstitutional, but you can see what they're trying to do, right? They're trying to get around, they're trying to limit the executive power. So they pass the piece of legislation. They pass it. It's vetoed, of course. They pass it over the veto. Supreme Court's just chilling on it. They don't have anything to say about it. And Johnson believed it to be unconstitutional. And so he fired Stanton anyways. So now Congress has grounds because he has broken this law and like doesn't allow Stanton in the building and all of this. So now Congress believes that they have grounds to impeach Johnson. Technically, yes, it's a law. And so they charge him with 11 counts of impeachment, 9 in violation of the Tenure of Office Act. So he fired some other people too. And and remember that impeachment. So we just kind of went through this in more recent years with the impeachment of President Trump. So there have been 3 presidents now in American history that have been impeached. Andrew Johnson was the first during Reconstruction. Bill Clinton is going to be impeached in the 90s over a scandal. And then President Trump was impeached earlier this year over a scandal. So remember that the impeachment process is a trial. Like if someone's been impeached, that doesn't mean that they're kicked out of office. All it means is that there is an investigation and evidence is brought forth and people testify. And then the Senate votes on whether or not they should be removed from office. So the House of Representatives has the trial. The Senate is the vote on it. And so in this case, right, so Johnson is a Democrat. The majority are Republicans. 7 moderate Republicans joined the Democratic Party in voting against conviction. So he missed conviction by 1 vote because a lot of the talk among Republicans was, this is a little sketchy. This would be a really bad precedent. And basically what they did is they picked country over party, right? In this situation where they said, yeah, we don't like Johnson. Yeah, we don't get along with him. Of course, we believe that we like the Military Reconstruction Act and that should be implemented. We think that Stanton should be the Secretary of War and he should implement it. But we passed a law that might not be constitutional in order to limit his power and to trap him in this position where we could impeach him. And that's dirty politics. And hopefully we're going to learn something from that. I don't know if they have, actually, to where you have to do the right thing because it's the right thing to do and not technically win on technicalities. Because here's the thing, is when your party's in power and in control, it's fine and dandy for you to do sketchy political tricks. But what happens if the shoe's on the other foot and you're in the minority and the other party does something that's maybe even worse? It's like chipping away at the Constitution, right? It's about kind of the integrity of the office and taking that oath to the Constitution and doing the right thing. They did it here, I do believe, even though Johnson was not a good president at all whatsoever. In this specific situation, though, many historians think that even though technically he should have been removed from office for breaking the Tenure of Office Act, it was a lot of dirty politics going on during this time. And Johnson was guilty of it as well. So 1868, Democrats don't want anything to do with Johnson. So they nominate Horatio Seymour. The Republicans are going to nominate General Ulysses S. Grant. He symbolizes the war and the kind of that connection to Lincoln. Everybody loves him. No political experience, but he is a war hero. Kind of got that leadership quality. Grant is super fascinating if you think about his story. At one point, he was like nearly homeless and an alcoholic and had a lot of problems. And the war actually gave him some purpose and some focus. And to think of where he kind of came from in between the Mexican-American War and the Civil War to becoming president of the United States. Now, what's important here is he's going to win by over 300,000 popular votes. 500,000 African Americans are voting on that Republican ticket. And that's going to really boost that. So that's kind of important in understanding that. And Congress knows that, and the Republican Party knows that. And so they are going to pass the 15th Amendment to guarantee the right for African American men to vote. They know that as more Southern states are being admitted into the Union, that they need, and they are going to have more representatives because the Three-Fifths Compromise is gone. Now that population counts towards representation. They know that they need Black votes, that that African American men need to be able to vote. They can't just be count towards representation but not voting. They need to vote for the Republican Party. And so they make that their priority. It's ratified in 1870. Mississippi, Virginia, Georgia, and Texas, they had delayed the Reconstruction process, so they were forced to ratify the 14th and 15th Amendment in order to be readmitted into the Union. In 1875, the a second Civil Rights Act is going to be passed that guaranteed equal accommodations in public places, so hotels, trains, theaters. It's going to prevent courts from excluding African Americans on juries. It has to be enforced. And by this point in time, in the late 1870s, so we are now 10 years after the Civil War. A lot of people are kind of ready to move on. It's not at the top of people's priorities on whether or not African Americans are getting equal treatment in the South, but it was a piece of legislation. In the South, there are a lot of Republican governments, which is interesting because, except for South Carolina. Now, South Carolina had a lot of freedmen that had been elected, but also South Carolina was heavily militarized in order to kind of protect those people. They're all white. So they're white Republicans, right? So a lot of people think when they see Republicans winning elections in these years, they think that they're African Americans. That is not the case. The majority of both houses in these state governments were white. Democrats gave them some nicknames, okay? So this was always something that kind of gets kids. So I just want to make sure that you understand that scalawags were Southern white Republicans, okay? So they were from the South. They've left the Democratic Party, and they are... or they kind of didn't have a party during those turbulent years. Some of them are former Whigs who are interested in the economic development of that state. Some of them are poor farmers that are trying to take advantage of this new beginning in the South, and they're looking for political power and economic power. And the Republican Party is going to be in the majority, so they're a Republican. The other group are going to be carpetbaggers. These are Northerners that move south in order to take advantage of the economic opportunities. So think about it. Land is really cheap. Labor, wages are a lot cheaper. The cost of living is a lot lower in the South. And that's even a thing today. If you think about how many of your family members, maybe your parents or your grandparents, moved from a Midwestern state or a Northern state into the South because it is more affordable. Homes are more affordable. Now, granted, minimum wage is lower and things like that, but it's a pretty good deal at least, okay? Some of them have humanitarian goals, teachers, missionaries, Freedmen's Bureau agents. Others, again, are just kind of looking like businessmen, and we'll talk about that when we talk about the New South. It is important to note that the Southern electorate was disenfranchised by about 10 to 15% of the white voters, okay? Meanwhile, more than 700,000 freedmen gained the right to vote. So where Southern whites was reduced by 10 to 15%, 700,000 African Americans are voting in the South, and they're voting for the Republican Party. It's the party of Lincoln, the great emancipator. Blacks outnumbered white voters in the South by 100,000, okay? They held voting majorities in about 5 states as well. So with that, eventually, what you're going to have is the freedmen are going to be kind of the backbone of the Southern Republican Party. 8 out of 10 Republican votes in the South. Republican rule is going to last the longest in states that had more African Americans. So Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana. Black office holders are very different than the Black voters, though. They are typically educated, probably from cities. They're not mostly former slaves, so these are free blacks. More than likely, they were also, many of them were mulatto. So we're assuming, right, that they were the descendants of former, like, they're the children of former owners that were maybe freed, before the war had ended. Maybe they were freed in like their wills and things like that. Black legislators are going to be more concerned with equal rights. Voters are more concerned about their economic future. They wanted land. So there was a little bit of disconnect there. And we'll talk about that argument over, do we worry about political and societal equality before economic equality? Like, which one should come first in order to help African Americans the quickest? During Reconstruction, so 1865, I would even say 1867 to 1877, there were 2 African American U.S. senators and 12 members of the House of Representatives. So we're talking about a time period where within 10 years of slavery being legal, you have African Americans sitting in the House of Representatives, like working in the Capitol building in the U.S. Senate, which is very impressive. Okay, Hiram Revels I love the story of Hiram Revels. He was elected in 1870 from the state of Mississippi. He took Jefferson Davis's U.S. Senate seat in the House of Representatives. That was where he was elected to. So you remember that Jefferson Davis was elected president of the Confederacy. The same number, now, with that being said, like, this is one of those successes, right? That you had African Americans able to vote and participate in government during this time. However, between 1865 and 1877, the same number of African Americans served in the Senate during Reconstruction as throughout the entire 20th century. So 2 Black U.S. senators served between 1900 and 2000. The same number that served between 1865 and 1877. It's kind of mind-boggling to think about. And that's because after 1877, the military is going to leave the South. We're going to talk about how they're going to take back that political power and discriminate African Americans for the next 100 years. So some Republican accomplishments: universal male suffrage, property rights for women, debt relief. I will make note that a lot of women were absolutely upset, and they had a lot to say about the fact that African American men got the right to vote before well-educated, pedigreed women got the right to vote. But we'll talk more about that later. They promoted the building of roads, bridges, and railroads, established hospitals for mentally impaired, homes for disabled people, especially since you had a lot of veterans with disabilities and amputations. Public schools that are going to benefit both whites and blacks. So remember that during the reformer movement, how Southern whites really weren't that interested in public schools. The Republicans are going to finally invest in that because they realize they're also going to invest in industry, in trade and transportation, because they realize at what a disadvantage it was during the war. They're going to invest in those things. All very expensive. They're going to raise some taxes, which is, again, something that Southerners didn't do very willingly, and sell some bonds. So there's controversy, though. If you really think about it, did they abuse their power for selfish ends? I mean, did they pass the 15th Amendment or lobby for the 15th Amendment because it was the right thing to do and it was important for African American men to have that right? Or was it because they were worried about maintaining political power? Maybe it was a mix of both. Some Republicans are going to take advantage of their power. They're going to take bribes from contractors, especially in like the building and new construction and new industry that's going to be formed in the South. But again, corruption was really common in politics, whether it was in the North and the South. We'll talk about political machines and all of that take place in the North as well. So some other plus sides with the 13th Amendment. there are things that, even though they're going to be African Americans are going to continue to be discriminated against in the South, there are things that they get to do for the first time that freedom brought them. They are able to marry, reunite with family, learn to read and write. They can migrate to other parts of the country. It is going to be more difficult to do than you would think. The formation of church, the African American churches, was vital to the freedmen, because they're avoiding white control. That was one area where African Americans were like, white people like didn't mess with that. And so they were able to have their own churches. And that's even why today within the African American community, churches are very important to the culture of the African American community. The Negro Baptist and African Methodist Episcopal churches, so sometimes you'll see them as the AME churches. That's what they're referred to today. Ministers are going to emerge as leaders in their community. It's no coincidence that within the civil rights movement, 100 years later, is really going to start with church leaders and ministers like Martin Luther King Jr. Education is going to become important as well. The formation of Black colleges. Today we call them HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities like Howard, Fisk, Morehouse. They're there to train ministers and teachers. So, and these are some of the most, elite, established, prestigious HBCUs in the country are Howard and Morehouse and Fisk in Tennessee. But it's interesting because they're training ministers and teachers, just like how Harvard and Yale and Cornell were formed 200 years before this in order to train ministers who were kind of that upper echelon of society. Exodusters, I do think that of the freedmen that were able to get out of the Deep South and avoid the discrimination that's going to follow over the next 100 years, probably a little bit better off than others. Even though discrimination awaited them in the West, exodusters were people that moved to Kansas, California, Washington State. They tried to kind of make their way as far as possible if they were able to do that. Some of them worked on the railroad and moved out west. They're going to escape some of it, but again, discrimination is going to follow them, and we'll talk more about that in class. They're called exodusters because of the Exodus, like referencing the Bible of when the Jews escaped bondage in the book of Exodus. So the Southern economy we've talked about before is in turmoil. They've lost that labor force. So landowners need to adopt a new form, a new system. And what's going to happen is two things. You're going to have tenant farming and sharecropping. Tenant farmers are going to rent the land from the owner of it. They're responsible for seed and equipment, et cetera. They just simply, like, they kind of are their own farmer. They just rent the land, they grow crops on it, and they sell the crops, make whatever money they have. Sharecropping was more designed for freedmen. So like tenant farmers, you had white and Black tenant farmers. Sharecroppers, you also had some white sharecroppers, but especially like in the Deep South, the majority of sharecroppers are going to be freedmen. So we're talking about, where they were enslaved on a plantation in 1860, they are now a sharecropper in 1867, where they, the landlord provides seed and equipment in exchange for a share of their harvest. So you would have X amount of land, 20 acres of land or whatever it might be, that's divided up among all of the freedmen that once were enslaved on that land. And they give you everything that you need. It's just like kind of how it was before. You harvest it, you show up, and you pay them 50% of whatever you make. Now, sharecroppers are going to remain dependent on that landowner. It's going to be an endless cycle of debt and local merchants. Most of the time, they aren't given enough land to actually ever make any money. They actually end up being in the negative each time. They're also going to be swindled. Because remember, education is still a little, spotty. And so if they had the opportunity to say like, oh, like this is only 100 pounds of cotton, or they would lie about the price. And so the math wouldn't add up. in order to kind of like steal from them and to keep them in debt, because if they keep them in debt, they can't leave. It ended up evolving into a new form of servitude. Many of the African Americans that were enslaved, they and their descendants for generations, because of Jim Crow laws that are going to be passed, and because of the sharecropping system, they are going to remain kind of bound to that land, even though they technically have the political the freedom to pick up and move. But if they're indebted, they have no money, they have no resources, they're stuck in poverty. How are they going to move somewhere else and pursue some other type of career? And also in these rural areas, there are no other jobs. Like, you're either a sharecropper or that's just what you are. That's the only thing that you have available to you. So by 1880, only 5% of Southern Blacks had actually become independent landowners. So that idea that Thaddeus Stevens was hoping for to create like this class of Black yeomen that own their own land, that just wasn't happening, because in most cases, those Southern states prevented it from happening. In the North, the Republican Party is going to shift from those reformers. So Thaddeus Stevens is going to die. Charles Sumner is going to die. And it's going to shift kind of more towards the spoilsman politicians. They're going to use patronage, which we remember like the spoils system from Andrew Jackson. The post-war years are going to be known for a lot of corruption, big business schemes, political bosses. You guys remember that during the Civil War, there were a lot of war profiteers where they made a lot of money off of the federal government in providing supplies to the United States government. And unfortunately, like President Grant is going to have a lot of people that worked for him that were corrupt. And Grant, it was kind of one of those things, like, he didn't really know what was going on. He probably should have been a little bit more involved. I'm sure he knew some sketchy things were happening, but I don't think he knew how badly it was going to kind of hurt his reputation. There was the Credit Mobilier affair, where insiders are giving stock to influential members of Congress to avoid being investigated into those huge profits that they're making off of the government and building the Transcontinental Railroad. It was really, really sketchy. It's kind of similar to, like, even today, I think about how U.S. senators had been briefed on COVID and how bad COVID was going to be back in like February. And then all of a sudden they start like selling stock and buying stock and doing things like that right before it plunged. It's kind of like to that level. So they had intelligence, they had the wherewithal to know how to profit from the stock market based on their political position. So it's like a conflict of interest. The whiskey ring is where some tax agents conspired with the liquor industry to defraud the government in millions of dollars of taxes. You had Tammany Hall, and we'll talk about this in when we talk about industrialization, but political machines, they stole $200 million away from the New York City taxpayers. So just a lot of scandals, like both political parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, were just taking advantage of their political power during these years. So in 1872, Grant didn't profit off of any of those, but again, it was kind of taking its toll. The Republican Party was a little hesitant about it, and so basically there's going to be some division within the political party. A liberal group of Republicans are going to break off and nominate Horace Greeley. He was an editor of the New York Tribune. Their goal was civil service reform. So civil service meaning like corruption, like doing away with spoils system, in the railroad subsidies, because that was leading to corruption. They wanted to withdraw the troops from the South and reduce tariffs and free trade. And so the Democrats, it became, the Democrats joined this party because they were on board with withdrawing the troops. So just think like small government. They believe that they were spending too much money in the South. And so it's just a very divided time. Republicans are going to bring back that old saying, waving the bloody shirt. And with that, as soon as they start connecting the Democrats to the war still, even though it's been a while since it's ended, Grant's going to win. Okay. And what's interesting is Horace Greeley is actually going to die like right before they count the electoral votes. So even if he had, that would have been interesting if he had won the election and then died before the electoral votes were counted. I don't know what would have happened, but that would have been interesting. And then you have the Panic of 1873. All that corruption and overinvestment and speculation in the railroads is going to lead to a bubble that's going to pop. And so it's going to lead to business failures, high unemployment, depression is probably one of the worst actually at this point in time. A lot of the debtors, so if they've taken on loans on these farms, were in trouble. The cities demanded the printing of more money. We will talk about the monetary policy of this time period over the break. You guys will learn about that. Grant is going to veto legislation that wants to release more greenbacks because they're worried about inflation, obviously. So it's going to create some division between the parties on monetary policy, but we'll talk about that again later. What the Panic of 1873 is going to do is it's going to start convince more and more Northerners in those years, because this is a depression that kind of lasts years, is that they would rather focus their energy and legislation and money, save money, and it pulls attention away from Reconstruction and the work, the progress that was actually being made in the South as it's being occupied by the United States military. So as radical Republicans are on their way out, right, they're kind of dying off, they're focusing more on the economy. In the South, Southern conservatives are called redeemers. So Southern Democrats start being elected into positions and they are redeeming the South, right? They're taking back the South. They're from different social economic backgrounds. It's kind of a little bit more, they're all Southern whites, but a little bit more diverse, like socioeconomically. Their view is states' rights. They don't like the federal legislation telling them what laws they can and can't have. So basically they want the black codes back. They want to reduce taxes, reduce spending on these social programs. It's basically white supremacy. With that, you have the KKK, Southern terrorist organization. They use violence and intimidation to prevent African Americans from voting, registering to vote, voting, owning businesses. They burned Black-owned businesses down, lots of lynching to keep them from voting. Congress does pass the Enforcement Acts in 1870, but again, very poorly enforced. The South has got a lot of land. It's a lot of rural areas. People are spread out. It's very difficult to enforce legislation like that. And also keep in mind too that and oftentimes the local sheriff's office or the judge or whatever, they probably were in the Klan or had immediate family members that were in the Klan. And so it's one of those things where they turned a blind eye. You can't kind of change the mindset of these people at that point in time, unfortunately. And as soon as the military is going to be withdrawn, everything is going to change from that. The Amnesty Act in 1872 is going to remove those last restrictions on ex-Confederates, except for those top leaders. So now they're voting. Democrats start to retake control of those state governments. And once they start taking control, they're going to start passing laws again. So by 1876, the federal troops had been withdrawn from all but 3 Southern states. Democrats had returned to power in all of the Confederate states except for, Florida, South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida. Republicans are going to nominate a man by the name of Rutherford B. Hayes. Democrats are going to choose New York Governor Samuel Tilden. Tilden is going to win a clear majority. However, in those 3 Southern states, it was contested big time. Violence broke out. They couldn't really trust the results. They couldn't clarify it. And so they were kind of sitting and waiting. It's right now we're sitting and waiting here in 2020 for the Electoral College to meet. Now in 2020, all of the votes have been certified by the governors, that they've gone through and they've said that yes, Biden won these states or Trump won these states. They could not certify the votes in those states. And so they didn't really know what was going to happen with the Electoral College. And so theoretically, the House of Representatives was supposed to decide this election because no one had the number of electoral votes, because you really weren't even sure about those 3 states. However, a backroom deal was basically created. So instead, they created the Electoral Commission. 8 Republicans, 7 Democrats were on this commission, and they negotiated. Now, the Democrats ended up being really upset about it in the long run, but the Democrats in that room agreed to this compromise. Republicans were kind of over Reconstruction anyways, fiscally, because they're worried about the economy. Again, a lot of those radical Republicans were gone, and so they were worried more about just kind of the future of the Republican Party, not so much of civil rights for freedmen in Alabama. And so what Southerners wanted out of this deal was they want all the troops out. They want all the troops out. They want to return to home rule, states' rights, and that's what they got. So it resulted in the Compromise of 1877. Reconstruction officially ends with the Compromise of 1877, which is very important in understanding. And with that brings in a new era of states' rights, this view of states' rights. Jim Crow laws are going to be passed, and the slaughterhouse cases are going to strike down a lot of that civil rights legislation, even though it wasn't enforced. Voter intimidation, it is going to pretty much ruin the South. In most cases, Southern society was much like that of before the Civil War ever happened, where African Americans couldn't vote. They didn't have any economic freedom. They were discriminated within society, except this time they were threatened with their lives, where before they were protected as like someone's property and there was value to their lives. Southern whites saw no value in their lives, and were almost like it desensitized multiple generations of Southern whites to promote racism. And remember that those laws existed all the way up until the 1960s and 70s. So this had detrimental effects in race relations, in economic mobility for most African Americans in the Deep South. And that's something that we'll really look into in the remainder of the year, is to see the consequences of failed Reconstruction policy and of the impact that Jim Crow South had on African Americans up until today. So I hope you learned something today, and I will see you next time. Bye.